Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the NYU Abu Dhabi Institute's second talk of the season. My name is Tishani Doshi. I'm Associate Professor of Practice, Literature, and Creative Writing at NYUAD. I would like to thank the Institute as well as Arab Crossroads Studies, the History and Literature and Creative Writing programs, as well as the Global Asia Research Initiative for co-sponsoring this event. It's an honor and privilege to introduce Pankaj Mishra to you today. Pankaj is the author of 8 books of fiction and nonfiction. He has published literary and political essays widely and won numerous prizes. He is an intellectual who calls for transformative thinking of self and the world. A critic and chronicler who is able to see both the large and small, who looks to the past and future simultaneously, someone who does not want to provide easy answers, but who encourages deep investigations into history, consciousness, and the imagination. I've followed Pankaj's work since his charming first book published in 1995, Butter Chicken in Ludhiana, Travels in Small Town India, followed by his novel, The Romantics, and his third book, An End to Suffering, which was described by the New York Times as an intellectual autobiography of the Buddha. It has been interesting to see his trajectory as a writer and thinker. Those early concerns about what happens to the marginalized and the dispossessed, what happens when societies are filled with untrammeled desire and consumption and hyper-individualism. Who controls the power of narrative, and how does this cultural monopoly affect the rest of the world, have expanded into his following 4 books, Temptations of the West, From the Ruins of Empire, A Great Clamor, and The Age of Anger. So many of Pankaj Mishra's concerns as a writer, capitalism, imperialism, colonialism, racism, the climate crisis, dominate our conversations today. He has consistently questioned the grand narrative of the West and worked to reverse that gaze. He challenges our assumptions of nationhood and identity. He is constantly seeking to reframe modernity and investigate the pathologies that have brought us to where we are. I cannot think of another public intellectual who can talk with ease about the rise of egocrats, the dangers of chamocracy, the crisis in modern masculinity, the perfection of Roger Federer's backhand, and the majesty in the writing of Mavis Gallant. But perhaps his most important quality is that he is a compassionate ethics and philosophy. His essays add complexity and texture to all our current debates, especially during this time of the pandemic. It feels auspicious somehow to hear Pankaj speak today about the end of the Western model when there will be a handover of power in the US. His most recent book, Bland Fanatics, Liberals, Race, and Empire, a collection of 16 essays, couldn't have been published at a more opportune moment. This is a writer and thinker we need for the times we are living through. Somebody who brings to the forefront the idea of solidarity, someone who is asking, what can we do to open up new possibilities? So, welcome, Pankaj.
Thank you very much, Tishani. It's a great honor to be actually introduced by you, a writer that I've admired for decades now. And really thank you for such a warm, eloquent, and generous introduction. Now, let's see whether I can match up to that. Some months ago during the lockdown, I was looking at my bookshelves, and I'm sitting in the study, and a lot of books here are unread, and they look back at me and torment me. And one of these books had a very appealing title, Radical Hope, Ethics in the Face of Cultural Devastation. So I brought it down from the shelf and started reading. It's a very short book. And I was very struck by how much it spoke to me, spoke to this moment, because what it describes is something we're all experiencing in different ways, which is conceptual loss. Let me try and explain that a little bit. I mean, the author, Jonathan Lear, starts with these Native Americans who back in the 19th century, like many indigenous peoples around the world, were forced to move from a nomadic to a settled existence. And in the process, they lost many of their sources of livelihood, but also, most importantly, they lost a connection with their intellectual, spiritual heritage. They lost the conceptual resources to understand their past and present. The problem for a Crow-Indian, Lear writes, wasn't just that my way of life has come to an end. The problem was that I no longer have the concepts with which to understand myself or the world. In other words, I have no idea what's going on. Now, that is a sentiment that I've heard often. I've often expressed it myself in recent years, experiencing, a whole series of political earthquakes, disasters, elections of various authoritarian figures. But I think that intellectual incomprehension or the failure to understand what's going on is most widespread among people who were telling us for a very long time now, for nearly 3 decades, I think since the end of the Cold War in the early 90s, that the world actually is getting better all the time. The world is being knit together very efficiently, very peacefully by their guidelines for capitalism, democracy, technology, of course, Silicon Valley being the great contributor to democracy and general peace. I'm sure many of you will remember the claims that were being made for Twitter and Facebook just a decade ago. And I'm referring to people mostly in the Anglo-American intelligentsia, people in Britain and the United States, writers, intellectuals, journalists, a whole intelligentsia that was basically telling us that we should follow their guidelines for capitalism, for democracy, and the rest of us would also find ourselves enjoying the power and privilege that this white minority in Britain and America has enjoyed for a very long time. The leaders, United States and Britain, and if you look at the rhetoric of many of their politicians, Barack Obama is a classic instance, where when he was elected, there was this expectation that we're all entering a post-racial age. And as he himself wrote, Obama wrote actually just a month before Donald Trump's election, that we're all embarking on a race for new frontiers and Americans are inspiring the world. Of course, at one level, this narrative of a global journey to the promised land led by the United States and Britain, this narrative was always very implausible, very hard to believe for most people outside these countries. Because if you cast your mind back to events of the last 20 years, just the main events, think of the terrorist attacks on 9/11, then intensified globalization, at the same time, the rise of China happening together with a calamitously failed war on terror, then the financial crisis of 2008. If you think about all these events, it becomes clear that the world actually was moving into a completely different and new historical period. Now, of course, after nearly a year of the pandemic, it's even clearer if the true test of good government, is its ability to produce a good, efficient administration, then of course the United States and Britain have failed ruinously. Both countries, we know, had weeks of warnings about the outbreak in China. There were nations that had responded very early, South Korea, Taiwan. They had offered a number of ideas and strategies through their own experience that we could have implemented, adapted. But you look at, you think about what the leaders of Britain and the United States were saying back in February and March, early March, about how they're going to deal with this pandemic. Trump saying, I think it's going to work out fine. On 3rd March, I remember that day, the same day that the UK's scientific advisory group said, please don't shake hands, please stop shaking hands. The UK Prime Minister goes to a hospital which is actually treating coronavirus patients and then tells the press afterwards, I shook hands with everybody, you'll be pleased to know. And I continue to shake hands. So what, a year on, what we're looking at is a utter disaster, literally hundreds of thousands of avoidable deaths in both countries. And we're not even at the end of this process. I fear a period of greater devastation lies ahead. Tens of millions of people are likely to lose their sources of livelihood and dignity. Of course, in order to deal with all this, we need faster scientific advances, technical advances. We need new modes of coordination, global public health, international environmental agreements. There are so many things that we need to work on. But I think most importantly, we need to reconfigure the way we look at the world today. Not just the world today, but also the past. We need to understand that many of the ideas and assumptions that had been operative all these decades, whether about the leadership of the United States or Britain, their role as teachers to the rest of the world, people who insisted that there was no moral or practical alternative to American-style democracy and capitalism, all these ideas and assumptions have become completely obsolete. I spoke earlier of conceptual loss. I'd like to know, for people who are insisting that there is no alternative to American-style politics and economy, how do they explain how China, for instance, a communist-ruled country, became central to global networks of trade and finance? There's also more evidence of conceptual loss, more evidence of bewilderment when you look at the response to Black Lives Matter or the politicization of young people in many parts of Britain and the United States. And also this new consciousness, which is very rapid and really very swift, a historical consciousness of how slavery and racial capitalism underpinned the wealth and power of the United States and Britain. Tishani mentioned earlier about these themes of slavery and racial capitalism. And she was right in the sense that, many of us have been talking about these issues for a very long time and finding ourselves up against ideological, intellectual orthodoxies that would simply not accept any kind of discussion or debate about these issues. The simple idea that slavery and racial capitalism underpinned the wealth and power of the United States and Britain was denied for so many years. Now, of course, young people are out there discovering these things for themselves, talking to each other, making these ideas mainstream. So in many ways, what the earthquakes, the upheavals of our times have exposed is a devastating deficit of conceptual resources. And, you know, it is not going to be addressed by anything that happens with this new US administration that is coming in today. Trump is heading back to Mar-a-Lago in Florida as we speak. But some signs of what we can expect, even after he's gone, were there a couple of weeks ago when those Trump supporters assaulted the Capitol. I think we are going to see a lot more of that. At the same time, we are also going to see a lot of blind faith, a lot of emotional and intellectual investment put in the idea that Joe Biden somehow is going to restore the old order. If you read many of the mainstream publications of London and New York, whether it's the London Times or the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times or the Economist or the Financial Times, you'll find again and again, well, certainly a lot of complaints, laments about the Trump era, but also a lot of expectations that we are now, you know, past that era, and now Biden is going to, you know, essentially take us back to where we were and, you know, get a kind of some kind of a reset. On the whole, I mean, when you consider these laments and these hopes, and they're mostly coming from an overwhelmingly white, male, middle-aged group of people. And what they really bring to mind is something James Baldwin said actually as early as the 1960s. Again, in some ways talking about the loss of conceptual resources. And what Baldwin said was very strongly phrased, and I quote it, "The white man's world, intellectually, morally, and spiritually, has a meaningless ring of a hollow drum and the odor of the smell of slow death." Now, everything I've said, I mean, you know, what I'm basically pointing to is the urgent need for a new framework to understand the forces at play today and in recent decades. But I feel that it'll only really come about if you make a conscious attempt to interrogate and also discard the formative influences of many writers, intellectuals, and commentators over the age of 40. This is a really crucial break-off point that. There's a writer many of you would be familiar with called Tony Judt, who was born in 1948, a great social and cultural historian. In an interview, he once spoke of, and I quote him, a pretty crappy generation he belonged to, which grew up in the 1960s in Western Europe or in America, in a world of no hard choices, either economic nor political. So the way Jude saw it was that many of his peers, they moved from these sort of leftist postures of the 60s and 70s into this business of material accumulation and personal security. And likewise, in their intellectual journey, they moved from leftism to thinking that, there is really no alternative to neoliberalism. There is really no alternative to deregulation and privatization of the kind Ronald Reagan and Thatcher were starting to propagate in the 1980s. And this generation of Jutes was also quick to internalize the belief when the Berlin Wall fell that liberal democracy and capitalism had scored a stunning victory. Now, Jude was speaking of, people of his generation, but I think there is actually a younger generation than his, and they have a similar worldview. And its members are actually, people who grew up in an even more complacent era, which is the end of the Cold War. And many of them are entrenched in very senior positions in magazines, newspapers, television channels, think tanks, university departments in metropolitan Britain and America. And when they were growing up during the 90s, which was the peak triumphalist period, they simply assumed that American-style democracy and capitalism had more or less been fine-tuned at home, and there was time to export it abroad. And that was only a matter of time before they were embraced by these authoritarian countries like China and Russia. It was only a matter of time before, India, which was assumed to be, a fully democratic society, only a matter of time before India became a stakeholder in the Western international liberal order. Now, of course, these fantasies of two Western generations, we can see them very clearly. We can see more clearly the intellectual narcissism implicit in them. And once we actually start to look at them closely, I think we can then also see the deeper structural changes of this very unfamiliar world that we are living in today. And these changes, I would argue, flow primarily from decolonization, the central event of the 20th century. Now, even during the 50s and 60s and 70s, when the post-colonial world was in a very different shape altogether, even then it was clear that the world's future is going to be decided by ideas, movements that happen in places that are geographically very remote from Western Europe and the United States, places that actually host the vast majority of the world's population. The Chinese Revolution, for instance, always seemed to hold greater consequences for the wider world than, say, the Russian Revolution. And when Mao Zedong declared in 1949 that the Chinese people had stood up after a century of humiliation by Western countries, even back then it seemed this is more than just boosterish rhetoric, because what it is inaugurating, these words, they are inaugurating a very determined, obviously, littered with calamities, but nevertheless extremely successful pursuit of national wealth and power. So today, I think it's much easier to see today that everything important that has happened in the United States and to a certain extent in Britain, whether it's the election of Trump, white supremacist upsurge, extreme inequality, outsourcing of jobs, deunionization, none of these things can be explained today without reference to the rise of China as a manufacturing giant and aggressively nationalist world power. So if you want to understand the contemporary world, it's not enough to simply add, as we've been doing, the history of democratic India, a history of authoritarian China, to these narratives of Western dominance and Western eminence, and say at some point these trajectories of India and China, they all converge onto the Western narrative. I think it means, to understand the contemporary world, I think it means abandoning the whole structure of preconceptions on which this parochial Anglo-American view has long been based. The sort of drums that James Baldwin spoke of, the nearly broken drums, but it is actually, harder than it seems to just retire them, because the perceptions, the modes of thought and perceptions, the self-images that were developed by the Anglo-American intelligentsia are not only very pervasive, they are deeply tenacious. And they all, obviously were strengthened during the Cold War when the so-called free world was up against the communist order led by the Soviet Union, also China. And there was a lot of, stakes in this ideological clash, people saying, Western style democracy is a fraud. And many people actually believe that. And in order to combat this notion, the anti-communist writers, commentators in the so-called free world consistently overestimated their own societies. They consistently saw in it more widespread and enduring material and intellectual uplift than could be supported by historical facts. I mean, in many ways, what many young people are today discovering is that that behind the propaganda of freedom and democracy, there were these very ugly realities that they hadn't been taught about, they hadn't been told about, whether it's about slavery or whether it's about imperialism in the case of Britain. And I think what also happened during the Cold War, which is a very significant period for the strengthening of these, what are mainstream ideas of Anglo-American. One of the things that happened was that liberalism became the dominant, not only the dominant, as a very important critic, Lionel Trilling, put it, not only the dominant, but even the sole intellectual tradition, which was very odd, this kind of promotion for liberalism, because before the Cold War, in the years leading up to the Second World War, there was this idea that liberalism is too complicit in the disasters of ruling classes in various parts of the world. Liberals have become too unaware of how much they represent particular class interests, how much in the way they think about the world has been corrupted by their class interests. But nevertheless, as the Cold War intensified, liberalism came to be the idea that was set against the miserable realities of Soviet and Chinese communism. It was around that time that liberalism started to acquire a very prestigious intellectual ancestry, with John Locke and Hobbes enlisted as ancestors. There's also a whole lot of discourse about the Enlightenment, which we still see very much today, as how the Enlightenment is the source, the ultimate source of the free world's uniquely good, great privileges. Now, we know that the Enlightenment was questioned very severely in Europe itself from the late 19th century onwards. Nevertheless, in the last half century or so, it has become a way of congratulating oneself that we belong to this wonderful, great tradition. I'm sure some of you are acquainted with the work of Steven Pinker, who has published various door-stopping books claiming that things are getting better all the time, and that really is the Enlightenment that we should credit, and people who can't see that things are getting better all the time are simply too blinded, or they're crazed leftist, or too deluded by anti-Enlightenment loathing to really see how things are getting better. Now, obviously, that kind of narrative is not persuasive to many people today who want to know how it became possible for white supremacism to become as important as it has in recent years, how it became possible for white police officers to murder Black people with the consent of a sitting US president. These glowing accounts of the free world as a custodian of civilized values, of democracy, of liberalism, heir to the Enlightenment, and the nemesis of totalitarianism, they were not going to be of much help to people in the present, partly because these mythologies, these Cold War mythologies of virtue, suppress too many awkward facts. I mean, to give you just one example, like these sort of Enlightenment sages like Voltaire, who described Black people as animals with little or hardly any intelligence. John Stuart Mill, who assumed that Indians were barbarians, unfit for self-rule. But nevertheless, these facts, which, obviously doesn't mean that we should stop reading these figures, but it certainly complicates their thought, complicates their influence, wants to make us interrogate the role of liberal political philosophy in the practice of imperialism. Once you take away these facts, then you're looking essentially at a feel-good narrative, how we all came out of the Enlightenment and have become progressively smarter, more civilized. So there was that obsession with the Enlightenment, and then there was this fixation rather, with the crimes of Stalin and Mao Zedong and Hitler. Again, I mean, all of this managing to obscure the very long centuries of global violence and dispossession that made two countries in particular, Britain and the United States, uniquely powerful and wealthy. Is a very astute philosopher called Lorna Finlayson, who quite recently wrote that as surely as terrible crimes have been committed by socialist states, the history of liberal nations is the history of systematic acquisitive violence, from the genocide of indigenous populations to slavery to contemporary regime change and humanitarian intervention. This much is uncontroversial, even though it may not be thought relevant or polite, perhaps, to talk about it. So, of course, who was going to talk about this? Not people who were inventing entire intellectual genealogies, Enlightenment, counter-Enlightenment, romantic irrationalism, Islamic fascism, genealogies invented to define the enemies of the liberal democratic West, to make the liberal democratic West look virtuous. And people who could talk about these subjects, the long-term victims, and therefore very close observers of the Enlightenment West and of the Enlightened West, those people were effectively silenced or marginalized. So the problem with so much of the discourse that emerged from these two countries in the last decades was not only, that the elites, their philosophies were corrupted by their class interests, but also that their outlook, the so-called liberal internationalist outlook, amounted in practice to either obliviousness to or contempt, reflexive contempt for other worldviews. You could just pretend that, many parts, a vast majority of the world's population simply does not exist. It was really, literally possible to pretend that all these many countries, all these many societies, they've had very few contributions to make, sometimes no contributions at all. I mean, given how little they were mentioned. There's a very good example I'd like to bring up of a philosopher who was much talked about, much celebrated in both England and the United States, Isaiah Berlin, who came to prominence after the Second World War precisely when you had anti-colonial movements across the world starting to achieve their delayed victories, precisely at the time when civil rights movement in the United States intensified their long battle for essentially basic rights. You know, and we also know that by the time Berlin started to become prominent, you've already had a huge archive of political thought developed in different non-white parts of the world. I mean, obviously, people who were degraded by racist Western empires had very different ideas about how to achieve liberty and justice, how to organize their society. So a range of figures from, you know, Tagore, who was a poet, Gandhi, Sun Yat-sen in China, Du Bois in America, any number of figures you can name from different parts of Asia, Africa, Latin America, Jose Marti, I'm forgetting, who all offered a very strong critique of Western political economic arrangements, but also alternative visions of human coexistence on a planet they recognized was very fragile. Of course, we know that in the post-colonial era, many countries in Asia and Africa started to flounder after liberating themselves from their white rulers. They had many problems. They were formally sovereign, but their sovereignty was radically curtailed by the Cold War and then economic new imperialism. But you know, this experience, this very fraught experience of failed modernization, state building, then you had secessionist movements, militant insurgencies, you had dictators in many countries. All this provoked an even deeper intellectual engagement, you know, with what are the perennial problems of politics and society. So whether, you know, it's the work of the Egyptian economist Samir Amin, or the Indian social psychologist Ashish Nandi, or the Moroccan feminist Fatima Mernissi, the Jamaican historian Orlando Patterson, I mean, any number of people I could name, their work is really exemplary in the way it overturns assumptions derived from a history of Western exceptionalism. But their voices were rarely heard in the Western mainstream. So there was very little challenge until very recently to the presumption that the so-called liberal democratic political institutions of Britain and the United States can be disentangled and assessed separately from such grossly illiberal practices as slavery and imperialism. Now, Isaiah Berlin himself, a great philosopher of liberalism, ignored its complicated history and barely acknowledged any non-Western intellectual and political tradition. I mean, he's very famous for his essay, Two Concepts of Liberty, in 1958. This is the year after Little Rock's Central High School, the images of forced integration are circulating globally. This is also a peak year of decolonization, but Berlin overlooks all these quests for collective and individual liberty launched by non-white peoples and nations. I mean, simply assuming, like John Stuart Mill, like many philosophers before him, that really it's only the freedom of the propertied, already free propertied white male mattered. This, you know, notion that essentially Western political institutions are fundamentally oriented to delivering liberty and justice. Now, you know, there's a lot of questioning of that idea, but you can also see it embraced by John Rawls, probably the most influential book of political, author of the most influential book of political philosophy in the late 20th century, A Theory of Justice. Well, the strange thing is that these very parochial frameworks of thought that came from members of a credentialed Western intelligentsia became hegemonic inside and outside academia just as the United States and Britain entered this sort of long period of decline in the 1970s. So essentially a small group of white, mostly male, political philosophers working at a handful of elite institutions in the United States and Britain remained long after decolonization, the heralds and prophets of modernity, theorizing at length about global justice, human rights, you name it, while disregarding the experiences that bound and still bind the colonizers to the colonized, the settlers to the indigenous peoples, and the free to the enslaved. But what mattered was a deep facility for people entering academia with their historically innocent abstractions. And that's how you moved ahead in academia. So the consequence was that a whole past of conquest and domination and its political legacy, which we see today, was erased. What is being recovered by efforts like the New York Times's 1619 project, however belatedly or however imperfect this project might be, at least it's making an attempt, because the worldview that it is challenging was really disconnected from both history and contemporary reality. It was really almost a kind of propaganda. Now, coming to the last bit of my talk, I'm thinking, what is it that we can actually do to really deal with what is essentially, ghosts, various ghosts, liberalism, democracy, the free world. How do we get rid of them and start again intellectually? I think it's very clear that the kind of intellectual narcissism which credited moral virtue and political wisdom to countries like India, simply because India appeared to conform to some Anglo-American notion of democracy and capitalism, I think it's very clear those notions will have to be abandoned. We definitely need to pay more attention, especially after the pandemic, to the specific historical experiences and political traditions of Germany, Japan, South Korea, countries that were once described and dismissed as authoritarian, protectionist. We have to understand the ways they have mitigated the suffering caused by both man-made change and sudden calamity. Of course, post-pandemic, the idea of building state capacity, which is alien to Britain and the United States today, and accounts for much of their disasters, that idea will have to be grappled with, because COVID really has exposed the world's greatest democracies, whether India, Britain, or United States, as victims of prolonged self-harm. At the same time, countries with strong state capacity have been far more successful at containing its spread. And they also look better equipped to cope with the social and economic fallout. How else can we also escape this intellectually enfeebled milieu where the self-interests and self-perceptions of privileged white men are passed off as global thinking? World philosophy, world history are essentially Western in nature and origin. Of course, an essential task here would be to address, and your university is actually extremely well placed to address the staggering, and they're staggering when you think about it, the staggering imbalances of intellectual life. To give you an instance, newspaper columnists in India, China, Egypt, or the UAE is very unlikely to be recognized as an authority on global affairs unless he or she can demonstrate some basic knowledge of Euro-American political traditions or intellectual traditions. Most Western scholars let alone newspaper columnists, do not have even a passing acquaintance with Indian, Chinese, African, and Arab history and thought. But, adding a few unfamiliar names to the curriculum, which is something already, by the way, fiercely resisted by the conservative right in Britain and America, I'm not sure whether it's going to really truly advance global thinking. It might advance the corporate aims of diversity and inclusivity. Something more radical will still be required to avoid total conceptual loss, which is the interrogation of an intellectual tradition that has actually distorted our sense of reality. And we'll have to also relearn a lot of world history with the recognition that fundamental assumptions about the inferiority of non-white peoples have tainted much previous knowledge and analysis. Now, this may all seem like a very tall order, but the alternative is really to keep banging the same old drum that Baldwin spoke about, even as it falls apart. Thank you.
Thanks, Pankaj. Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes,
okay.
I can. Thank you.
Thank you. We have a lot of questions that have already come in, so I think we have some time to just have a conversation. And I would urge people putting their questions in to be specific and as pointed as possible. I'm gonna start with this one. Pankaj, as a writer, do you reflect on your positionality in writing about topics like caste or the crisis in Kashmir? And are you mindful of speaking for others, savior complex?
I think, when I first started to write about Kashmir, that's a very good question. Kashmiris were more or less invisible in the Indian press, not to mention in the international media. This was in the late 1990s. So whether you liked it or not, you felt you had a sense of responsibility to articulate the great suffering and trauma that many Kashmiris underwent and were completely unable to express, to convey to a broader audience. So in some ways, you end up representing a people, you end up speaking on your behalf, even though it is a presumptuous act. Over time, as more and more Kashmiri writers have emerged, journalists, novelists, there's so much talent in Kashmir, and we've seen more and more of it in the last 2 decades. I think, it's important to step back and let people speak for themselves. But sometimes, there are communities who have been deprived of participation in the public sphere. And that's when, you're required to make interventions.
Okay. This is a question about, are there any non-authoritarian political movements or hopeful strands of thought in the West or in the East? Or will this struggle for fascist, communist-style domination of society by governments, police authorities, spying intelligence be the new norm?
I think there's going to be obviously a very intense struggle in the years to come between the forces that just been described. And I think people belonging to a generation that feels very short-charged, very, in a way, let down by previous generations. And I'm speaking, primarily of people now in their late teens, 20s, early 30s, who are politicized like no other generation I've seen previously. And they have not yet organize themselves into movements, or they haven't manifested their strength in political parties. They're far too young for that. And also, I think, political organization doesn't quite happen in the same way it used to. But nevertheless, I think the energy and the determination of many of these young people, many have now spent a whole year cooped up inside their homes, looking at the shambles that governments have made of everything. And I don't think this experience is going to just fade away. It's going to politicize this generation. And I think this generation will be the backbone of any positive political formation that we might see in the next decade or so. I feel pretty confident of that today.
Here's a question about language. How do you think we could achieve a truly global knowledge production and dissemination at universities all over the world? How much of an opportunity and obstacle is the English language as a lingua franca in this context? What are tangible steps that institutions can take in this regard?
Well, definitely, language learning and moving away from English, because, at one level, it's a very convenient language. It's a language of globalization, all kinds of deal, transactions, communications happen in it. But at the same time, intellectually, it's extremely, constricting. And what it means is that we cannot explore large tracts of human experience, essentially. We cannot really understand so much about India. We know that unless you know a local language or of a particular region. And likewise, we have China today, a powerful country, and how little we know about its philosophical tradition and its political tradition. I've been learning Spanish recently, and I feel like a whole new world is opening up before my eyes. It's both exciting, both thrilling, and I know that despite all my reading of Spanish writers and philosophers available in English, this is a world that I've simply not encountered before. So yes, absolutely. I think that would be the one way to go forward.
A couple of related questions here about cancel culture. I would be curious to get your take on the notions of cancel culture being woke in the current Anglo-American discourse. Are those concepts similar to the notion of political correctness, political strategies of the right conservative spectrum? And if so, how can they be prevented from resonating among large parts of the population?
It's a very important question, because I think, one reason why these ideas become dominant and start to circulate is because of the enormous cultural heft that the political right has in Anglo-America today. So when you examine the notion of cancel culture, it turns out that it reflects the anxiety of a very powerful, already very powerful and long privileged elite to speak, which has spoken uninterruptedly without challenge for a very long time. And now it finds itself challenged, questioned by all kinds of people, whether on social media or indeed on university campuses, and feels that their right to be wrong, sometimes all the time, is being questioned, is being challenged. So this hysteria about cancel culture, which makes it seem like cancel culture is something real, something genuine. Of course, there are people all the time being fired unfairly for all kinds of reasons. Cancel culture in some ways has always been with us. But this notion of cancel culture, which essentially confines the perpetrators of cancel culture to particular ethnic, racial groups, or indeed particular genders, this is very insidious. And I think the reason why it's been so successfully branded and spread and used as a way to mock people who are trying to change the discourse, you call them woke, you call them politically correct. These are ways to essentially to delegitimize all kinds of important intellectual and moral discourses that we need right now. Because that is a tactic I was talking about earlier in my talk. About the orthodoxies are so entrenched, and now they're being challenged, and there is this sort of reaction that essentially this is all aimed at bringing us down unfairly and stigmatizing us and canceling us.
Gosh, the questions are coming thick and fast now. So I'm going to have to read quickly. Is there a particular political philosophy that stands out to you as a desirable alternative to liberalism in the West?
I think, the problem really begins with this kind of prescription, this sort of notion that there is something out there which has already been, in a way, tried and tested, and we simply have to adopt it to our purposes, and then things will work out fine. I feel like this may be at the bottom, this may be the source of the problem that many of us are experiencing today, which is, you adopt ideas that are actually fundamentally unsuited to you. Don't wait for ideas to emerge out of a real engagement with the world, real engagement with your local situation, with your neighborhood, with your region, with your country. You simply adopt these notions from elsewhere and think, they have worked out somewhere else, they will work out here. It turns out that what you knew about them working out elsewhere was mostly wrong. And that was actually a kind of propaganda. So I think we need to find ideas really in many ways out of a particular experience and not just kind of adopt them. I mean, of course, there are a whole range of philosophies and political systems and economic systems on display there, but things will have to emerge out of our own particular histories and traditions and engagements.
Are you concerned that your pessimism about universal human rights and the democratic model is fundamentally discouraging movements such as the Tunisian Revolution that have been successful? Are they somehow sellouts by embracing a democratic Islam? Also, are you concerned that some of your positions play into the propaganda of states oppressing human rights?
Well, I think the problem is that once you have a shallow discourse about democracy and capitalism, then authoritarian regimes are going to use that hypocritical and shallow discourse to shore up their own legitimacy. This is something that is happening all the time, and we see that today with China and Russia. The important thing for all of us who actually genuinely wish to advance democracy in our respective societies, the spirit of egalitarianism, fair social economic arrangements, is that we have to separate them from this particular discourse which has tainted these ideas for so many people. That is a big challenge, and this is what I mean. When I talk about ideas, experience emerging out of a particular experience, rather than coming back to a place like India or Indonesia and saying I picked up these ideas about democracy, and while I was living in the West, and this is the way to implement those ideas. I mean, many of these countries have their own traditions of democracy. Have you thought about those? Have you looked into those? So I feel like we need to, at this point, start to separate what we want from discredited, delegitimized ideologies out there. Let Britain and the United States and China and Russia fight it out among themselves, one claiming to be democratic, the other accusing them of being hypocritical. We have to really separate these discourses from this kind of sterile and pointless discussion.
Some questions here about asking you to expand a bit on the concept of the West in your lecture. You've referred to the UK and the US. Someone else is talking about Greek. This is an earlier question. So could you elaborate a bit about the commonalities and differences between those two countries and other countries on the European continent? Do you see hope for their models, or are these inextricably connected to the end of the Western model?
No, I think, the important thing is that the model that has been hegemonic within the so-called West, and by the way, I think the West has now become a very incoherent entity. So I think we need to actually now look at what constitutes the West. Is it Germany? Is it the leader of Europe? Is it the United States? Is it? It's definitely not Britain today. But I think once you start sort of breaking it down, once you start looking at particular national experiences, whether of building the welfare state in Germany from the late 19th century onwards, which is very different from what happened in Britain and the United States at that time. When you start looking at the use of protectionist policies in Germany, then you're looking at a completely different conception of how societies can prosper. So I feel like once you start looking at these, I mean, what we are essentially still dealing with when we talk about the West are ideologies of the Cold War, which presented the West as this coherent entity. What I'm arguing is that let's break it down. Let's see through the constructed nature of this concept, of this entity, and look at Britain and the United States in particular. How little does Spain, for instance, have in common historically, their trajectory with Britain and the United States? I mean, Spain lost its empire a long time ago, and then whatever it had was really, very, very small. Portugal, another example, and of course, Italy. So all these countries, when you actually, take them out of this Cold War construction, will reveal a very different historical trajectory and development. I mean, that's one of the tasks ahead is to break free of this Cold War discourse. When I hear the words the West spoken, or when I talk about these, I mean, I often use it as a shorthand myself. But what I really am referring to are the dominant ideologies of Britain and the United States, and they have been absolutely dominant even within Western Europe and the American continent. So it's not the German notion of state building that people are following in India or Indonesia. I mean, it's the Reagan and the Thatcher ideologies of capitalism, of privatization, or unleashing the entrepreneur. Those are the ideologies that are truly universal. But once you start looking at other countries, then other histories will come into view.
This is the question about India. Do you think the interrogation of an intellectual order that you speak of at a global scale needs to be replicated for the intellectual hegemony of the upper caste knowledge production in India? How do you read the caste dynamics of narratives of and in India as a whole?
I think one of the very important steps forward in that direction would be to say, or would be to demonstrate, that much of the discourse about India is an upper caste discourse. The discourse about India as a democracy, India as a country that is increasingly converging with various Western models of democracy and capitalism. It is a kind of upper caste claim, a claim for dignity, for higher status, for recognition in the eyes of the white rulers of the world. And what it does is systematically ignore the many realities of India, which, some of the most prominent amongst them is the reality, the horrible reality of caste. And the fact that, all of us are infected with this ugly, inegalitarian ideology. I don't exclude myself, from this indictment, by the way, because I feel like all of us upper caste Indians have been shaped in ways that we've really not begun to understand. And so much of our outlook today is shaped by the privileges inherited with our membership of the upper castes. I mean, likewise with the same argument that I make of the elites, the ruling classes of Britain and America, I think the same arguments can be and should be extended to the Indian intelligentsia.
What are opportunities and limits for non-Western countries to intervene and break into the globally hegemonic discourse in the face of what is often political, military, economic power asymmetries? What are other potential players in this endeavor? Social movements, social media, NGOs, the media, etc.
I think it's actually hugely important to have independent platforms for debate and discussion. It could start at the university, but it cannot remain confined to universities in the global south. There need to be journals of opinion, there need to be periodicals. The trouble is many of these institutions, organizations come up, but then they become closely affiliated with uh, regional or national power holders, either ruling either particular regimes or people close to the regime. So to this day, we have no global alternative to the New York Times. That remains for people around the world, for many educated people around the world who work in English, the primary source of news. But the New York Times is an incredibly American newspaper. It reflects and propagates an American worldview. And I think many people, many readers do not realize that. And they really do think of it as a fount of objectivity. So I'm not saying that anything that emerges in response to it would then become an objective forum, but I think it would be a place ideally for different ideas, different ways of looking at the world, not just through an American lens.
Would you say that liberals framing themselves as opposition, even though they are themselves power holders, and that their opposition doesn't begin to challenge the neoliberal paradigm, is exactly what fuels American capitalist realism?
That's a very good question. I mean, I think, this is going to be very interesting in the next few years, where I think a lot of, careers are going to be made in this particular racket of posing as a great fighter of the resistance to Donald Trump and being successful in that endeavor. And in a way that leaves untouched, unaffected all your previous ideas and assumptions. You're just kind of longing to restore them, longing to make whole the world that was shattered by the election of Trump. And the underlying causes of that, because, in the end, Trump was a symptom of a much bigger problem. The symptom has gone away, but the problem persists. And the problem is of inequality, a state that doesn't function. I mean, there's so many problems. Trump was merely a symptom of that, but I think he was a great source of pain for many liberals simply because of the crudity of his style. George W. Bush, in many ways, caused a lot more damage than Donald Trump to various norms, to various democratic. He's the man who legalized torture, but we don't think of him in the same way we think of Trump, is because liberal angst did not extend to him so much, or was not so aggravated by the way he spoke or the way he moved, by his personal life for that matter. So I feel like just as the arrival of Barack Obama offered an opportunity for many liberals to redeem and to renovate their self-image, I feel like the departure of Trump is also going to offer them a similar opportunity.
Where is Egypt's place in this new world order, in your opinion?
Well, I think it's obviously one of the great post-colonial projects. Right from the very beginning. Many of us are old enough to remember the days of solidarity between countries like India and Egypt, and the exchange between the two, the continuous travel and the cultural exchanges. And And so too, someone of my generation, it feels, I've been there many times, it feels very much, I feel very much at home there. And very much in touch with events there through friends, and also affected by its tragedies and its suffering in a very direct way. So I think the last few years have been very particularly painful in this regard. But having said that, I still feel that there is so much potential there. There's so much energy there, and there's so much talent in that country, that it's very hard. It's going to be very hard to keep it down in the way it has been, and that we will probably see another eruption of that kind of energy in the years to come.
Okay, a question about Christianity. Would you classify Christianity, very much attacked in the West, as part of the Western model? Christianity has had quite a global outreach and persevered even as the colonial imperial systems that propagated it in the East, Far East, Africa, and Americas collapsed. Yet Christianity stayed and is cherished by the emancipated ex-colonized people. How would you explain its universal appeal across space and time?
I think, it's the most important religious and philosophical tradition in many ways because of its global reach. Like with many of these other figures and philosophies that we've discussed, whether it's liberalism or whether it's John Stuart Mill or Berlin, people should not be dismissed or disparaged simply because at different points in their lives, they have said something which today we find offensive, or if they've been part of some movement or something which we now find ugly. So to think of Christianity as allied to, which it was in many cases, to Western imperialism, and indeed to practices such as the Inquisition, would really in many ways be a great disservice, because I think what Christianity has given to the world is this extraordinary idea of equality. Equality originally before the eyes of God, and then equality as something that one should strive towards in our respective societies. So I really think a whole left tradition in the West and elsewhere would have been impossible without this inheritance of Christianity, this notion of equality. And it's very moving. I mean, the story of Jesus and his struggles in that regard, and his the reported sayings of his, I think that is an incredible heritage of humanity, and that remains intact. And you can see its reflection when the Pope today becomes one of the few people to openly criticize our existing political arrangements, our economic arrangements, when he criticizes the way many societies work today, our habits of consumption, and at the same time tries to move to the church in a more liberal direction. So I think the energies of Christianity are far from being exhausted, and that is evident in the way it still continues to spread around the world.
Okay, maybe just a few more questions. Pankaj, do you have the energy for?
Oh yes, yeah, couple more, yeah.
Okay. What is the role that you envision China will have in this new world order? You mentioned its enormous rise as a center of trade and capitalist player. Do you think it will be a model that others will seek to emulate? And how about its soft power potential when compared to the Western model?
I think China is way behind in all of these areas. It has never really seriously tried to project soft power. Having Confucius institutes is not going to, get it the power it would want for itself. And also, I think because it's surrounded by mostly adversaries, not friends. If you look at the map of the world that China is part of, you see, just how it doesn't really have that many friends, it doesn't have that many allies. So I think it's very unlikely that China is ever going to be as powerful and dominant as the United States and then before the United States, Britain was, it's going to have a very different destiny altogether. And it will be interesting to watch, I think, for most of us. But we're really simply not looking at another superpower that replaces a previous and exhausted superpower.
Okay. There is a question here. Oh, I've heard a noise. Somebody. There's a question here asking about why are you fascinated by Voltaire so much and Rousseau? How conflicted do you feel? What about space that are outside of the ontological meaning? So maybe I've truncated the question. So maybe talk about your fascination with Voltaire and Rousseau.
I was fascinated. I think I should clarify. Certainly, for a while, no longer. The fascination was partly, due to the fact that I was trying to figure out, while writing Age of Anger, a larger framework for my ideas and thoughts for the struggles that I wanted to portray in my book. And the two of them, rivals, intellectual adversaries, offered many interesting notions that I could work with. One person being an advocate of a commercial society, of consumption, of international trade. The other one warning against the temptations of that society and warning that individual souls are going to be corrupted by this whole process of wanting to be successful and prosperous and famous and recognized. So both of them offered very compelling visions of the world, and right at the start of the modern era. And I think in many ways, many developments since then can be mapped onto their ideas, their fears, and their fantasies, and their desires. So that's why they're so important and so crucial in many ways. As people to kind of stage these conflicting visions of the world and the conflict, the sort of larger conflicts that were still to come, to be able to actually in many ways anticipate those conflicts.
Okay. So I think we'll end with one final question. Pankaj, I just want to thank you again for your time and for generously answering these questions coming from all corners, and very sad that we couldn't have you with us in person. I think I'd like to ask you, Arundhati Roy wrote an essay, "The Pandemic is the Portal," talking about how the pandemic is an opportunity, about how we sort of emerge from this and how is it going to be. And the word pessimism has come up a few times in the questions and in articles and reviews, and I'm sure that you've been called that. And I'm wondering whether you could speak a little bit as to how you think we are going to emerge from this, and whether there is any kind of hope or anything that we can cling to that we call hope, aside from the obviously failing things that you've mentioned.
That's a very important question. I mean, I think you mentioned something in your introduction, something I'd written. I think it was the last sentence of Age of Anger about transformative relationship, or transforming the self and the world. And when I wrote it, it seemed incredibly utopian and incredibly optimistic that any such reckoning could happen. That as human beings living in this very traumatic era, we were even capable of such a reckoning. Well, it turns out that the last year has forced many of us into that kind of reckoning with ourselves, with the world that we live in. As I said, young people have been particularly rapidly politicized. By politicized, I mean simply coming into an awareness of injustice, of inequality as it exists and has existed. And many of us who weren't paying too much attention to these issues, who were simply, kind of living their lives, have become much, much more aware that these ugly, nasty realities exist, and they destroy human lives all the time as we speak. So the awareness of that, and also the more guilt-laden, painful awareness that we are in many ways complicit in that suffering, that in the way we live, in the way we consume, in the way we monopolize social capital, cultural capital, not to mention real capital, has created this very unjust world. So, you know, in many ways, the pandemic, Arundhati Roy is right, has been, although, you know, you wish there could have been a different way of reckoning with these things, but the sheer scale of this calamity has forced many of us into this examination. And I feel, you know, I remain more, I am actually now more hopeful than I was, say, a year ago, because I feel that I think this experience for many people would be formative, it would be deep, and it would shape many of their ideas and desires to change the world. And I feel like I don't think we've had a generation as committed as that for decades now. So, in other words, interesting times ahead.
Okay. Thank you everyone for tuning in, for your questions, and thank you again, Pankaj. Wonderful to hear you, wonderful to see you. Take care of yourself until we meet again. Okay.
Thank you so much, Tishani. That was great.
Bye.
Bye.